Okay, a huge thank you to Dr. David M. Lampton, Mike to his friends and colleagues, Professor Emeritus, former Hyman Professor and Director of SAIS China and China Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies, and Senior Research Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute. We'll be discussing his recent memoir from last year, Living U.S. China Relations, From Cold War to Cold War. The title says a lot, from Roman and Littlefield. Dr. Lampton has served as Dean of Faculty from 2004 to 2012 and has served as the President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. He's the author of many other books. I want to run through the titles just so you get a little bit of a scope of a few of these very, very important books within the field of political science, international studies, and as I was saying earlier, sort of creeping into our turf in history a little bit here, and I think in the best way.
I consider it an honor to be a historian.
I love it. I love the overlap of our fields, and I've got a few questions to talk about there. A couple of the texts, the really seminal texts of this world of China studies, interdisciplinary kind of China study, from UC Press, Same Bed, Different Dreams, Managing U.S. China Relations from 2002. Also from UC Press in 2008, The Three Faces of Chinese Power, Might, Money, and Minds. More recently, 2019, also from UC Press, Following the Leader, Ruling China from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping. I have a copy of that one here. And some of our lucky attendees here got copies of Living U.S. China Relations earlier as well. Professor Lampton's publications have appeared in many other outlets, sort of straddling the world of academia and also popular presses, from Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the American Political Science Review, China Quarterly, New York Times, Washington Post. He is currently, as I said, out on the East Coast and most recently affiliated with Johns Hopkins, but he is, I think, a Californian at heart because he got his BA, his MA, and his PhD at Stanford University, just up the coast. Dr. Lampton headed the China Studies programs at the American Enterprise Institute and at the Nixon Center, now the Center for National Interest. Having previously worked at the National Academy of Sciences, started his teaching career at the Ohio State University. He has an honorary doctorate from the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute of Far Eastern Studies. He is an honorary senior fellow of the American Studies Institute of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He was the inaugural winner of the Scalapino Prize in 2010, awarded by the National Bureau of Asian Research and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which is where I first bumped into Mike just a couple of years ago, when he gave a really beautiful talk to the Woodrow Wilson Fellows that almost had a kind of a eulogy sort of a tone to it, just in terms of the sadness of the term, the turn that China Studies is currently taking. And we'll talk more about that as well. He's also a Gilman Scholar at Johns Hopkins, consults with government, business, foundations, and is on the board of several non-governmental and educational organizations, including the Executive Committee of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, Colorado College's Board of Trustees. He was a firefighter at Stanford University in his undergraduate days. He was in the enlisted and officer ranks of the U.S. Army Reserves. I want to thank also Lucy Lee for joining us today. Lucy in the Yodi Oso You're Yours AANHPI Student Achievement Program, and she's keeping an eye on your questions today in Zoom land. So please go ahead and add your questions to the chat, and or you can raise your hand and ask them live after some preliminary opening remarks. I also want to thank Pamela Cross in the History Department, who makes so many of these events possible. It's a great pleasure, and now I'm going to step aside for Professor Lampton to give some opening remarks to begin our conversation about U.S.-China relations today. Thank you, Mike, so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Jeremy, and thank all the students and others who may be listening. I look particularly forward to speaking with a California audience because I was born in Glendale, not too far from where you are, and then spent the first 2 decades of my life after leaving Southern California to go to Northern California. So my life since then has been a migration east, but my heart's always been in San Francisco, so to speak. So anyway, I couldn't be more pleased than to be with you all today. This book was, I would say, the most fun book I've written for me, because it looked back on the kind of formative experiences that got me into the China field and made me recognize what a special time I grew up within the field, essentially between two periods of hostility. So I saw us, at the sort of depth of the first Cold War. We climbed out to a level of interaction with China for about 40 years that I never thought when I entered the field I would experience. And then, quite frankly, a series accumulation of frictions in both societies has us on a far different and more dangerous trajectory. So I see myself, in a sense, in the favorable interlude between two periods of friction. By saying Cold War to Cold War, I don't mean to say that this, whatever you want to call this period we're currently in, is identical to the first Cold War. But I think if you have to make an error, sort of recognize the degree to which there's similarity in process between the first Cold War and what's evolving. This current interaction and where we're headed, I think, will be more complicated than the first Cold War. And that may mean more dangerous along more dimensions, affecting more of the world. So, but ultimately, I'm an optimist because I really think that for mankind's survival, for the absence of war, for stewardship of the global economy and the global ecology, ultimately, we will once again conclude, and the we is China and the United States, that we have to cooperate. But how much difficulty we'll experience before we both of our polities reach this happy conclusion, we're in for a very complicated time. And this will be the history into which you're coming. This is going to be the world you're going to try to manage. And so I hope this book, by looking back how we handled the last 60 years, provides some guideposts, not exact roadmap, but some gets people thinking in ways that are more productive than might otherwise be the case. I just want to wind up the little introduction here by saying I think there are some ideas to think about. Think about U.S. China relations as not just an interaction between two nations, two states, two realist powers. It is partly that. But more fundamentally, it's a relationship between two societies, global society and then American society, civil society. It's state and local governments and provinces and special districts in China. So this runs the gamut of what you might call levels of human organization. And the relationship has to be managed effectively at all of those levels, not just between two presidents, between governors and mayors and nonprofit organization memberships and leaders and so forth. So the book is much more about that panoramic interaction than it is just between Washington and Beijing. Secondly, just keep in mind, things go up, things go down. Be a little philosophical. There's a kind of cyclical quality to U.S. China relations. And how we ought to view our role, I think, is let's try to shorten the downswings and lengthen the upswings. Sort of be the way I would try to think philosophically of managing things. I guess the last thing I would say is that don't underestimate Chinese power. We can always find reasons. They've got problems that we would never want to have. And so it's easy to think that in the end, we can strong arm China. Well, I think we certainly have to have our capabilities. We certainly need to be able to defend our own interests, but don't underestimate the capacity of China. We have to have a realistic assessment of what the capabilities of both of us are. We can overestimate our power, we can overestimate Chinese power, but if you err greatly in any direction, you're going to have a very tumultuous relationship. So assess China's power as realistically as you can and assess our own and be realistic about that. But Jeremy, I think that's all I want to say right at the moment.
Thank you, Mike. That's a great introduction. Like we said, getting up some of these vital ideas on the table. And you talked about considering the society to society as opposed to strictly a sort of Beijing-Washington or state-to-state relationship, and sort of thinking in that way. And this is, we talked about you as a political scientist thinking historically, and I sometimes try as a historian to think in political science terms, and I've had your books to benefit me in that way. I have a sort of hasty, maybe flippant metaphor for leaders of authoritarian countries and moving sort of past the simplistic authoritarian idea. And I think a misunderstanding of these leaders sometimes as puppeteers, and that's my sort of what I think is a misconstrual of leaders of authoritarian countries. And I think rather of a surfer, rather is try to stay above in front of the tide or on the top of the wave. And that's I recognize as a New Yorker as a very Californian metaphor, but sort of trying to stay in front of the wave as the surfer does to stay on it or in front of it. It seems, I think, that Westerners, especially when looking at China, misunderstand the nature of authoritarian rule. They dismiss the political and historical specificity that makes every government either authoritarian, whether authoritarian or not, demanding of a close and a careful study of its specificities. A leader is not able to simply impose their will on the populace with zero consequences forever. But I think there is a spectrum of personal politics, and we saw that in the grandest way with the personality of Mao, exercising an enormous amount of control at least within the party. And then maybe on the other side of the spectrum could be someone like Hu Jintao, for example, perhaps, who is less, I think, flamboyant in terms of exercising his own political will. And I think that's by design. And if we look at a sort of spectrum of rulers in a society like this, where do you think Xi Jinping falls on that, and maybe has fallen, and has he shifted his place on that spectrum of imposing his will or trying to impose his will as an individual? And again, sort of taking that, moving past that caricature of authoritarian rulers simply imposing their will on a population. Where does Xi Jinping fall in that sort of calculus?
Well, that's a great question. It's highly debated, but I will try to answer it. Let me just back up a stage and say, if you want to talk about strong leaders, think about Deng Xiaoping. And the reason I say that is he was the supreme leader of China, let us say from 79 to his death in the late 90s. And he had virtually no posts, not the top 3 posts. For the last decade of his life, the only post he had to be the supreme leader of China was president of the Chinese Bridge Association. And so when decisions needed to be made, they, in the end, were at least ratified by him, if not motivated by him. And I've always thought anybody that can run a country that's at that time about 20% of the world's people, and his only post is the head of the Bridge Association, that's power. So power is in the minds and in the acquiescence, in the legitimacy that society, for whatever reason, attaches to them. In that sense, Uh, and certainly Mao, I think, had that, but he also was very attentive to have the positions, the chairman, the head of the military commission, the president for many years. Or so he had posts and he had this sort of spiritual legitimacy. So your core question is, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeremy, how strong is Xi Jinping?
Yeah, yeah. How much is he able to impose a kind of individual will?
Right. Well, if you look at the posts he occupies the big three posts of head of the party and the military and head of state. So he certainly has those, but he also did Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao one better by heading almost all of what you might call the second tier policy coordinating committees, whether it's on the economy, on security, and so forth. So he created more and chaired more coordinating committees at the top level. So he has his hands on more bureaucratic levers directly. So if you look at posts, you'd have to say he's, uh, you've got Deng Xiaoping with no posts but all the power. So keep that in mind. But in terms of posts, I would say he's the most powerful since Mao. But if you ask a different question, what is the span of control of anybody? That is to say, in organizational terms, how many things can you actually keep track of? How many, what in corporate life would be called direct reports, how many people can you effectively directly manage? And this is before you even get into China's provinces, townships, villages, special districts, and then huge vertical bureaucracies. So I would say, from my point of view, Xi Jinping's got too much span of control. He might be more effective if he actually delegated more. But what you see now is the sort of cult of personality, subordinates fearful of telling him bad news, take COVID. They didn't want to tell him it was bad news down in Wuhan, and the whole thing got out of control. So I see Xi as is very strong in terms of positions, very strong in terms of acquiescence by subordinates at the current time. But fundamentally, I see him not nearly as strong as Deng Xiaoping in that more fundamental sense that I put.
Yeah, that's really interesting contrast. Deng Xiaoping, where they sort of invented the term paramount leader to kind of capture everything he was. And it seems that others could take the fall if there was an issue. If, for example, something like 2012 happened again, where there were patriots in the street getting out ahead of the government in its anti-Japanese rhetoric, that might be tricky for Xi Jinping to manage. So that makes sense in terms of the having too much responsibility in those positions.
Right. He could be an easy fall guy.
Mm. Yeah, right. Very elaborate fall guy to put him up there for a change of directions. That's great. I want to ask about a little bit about because I'm interested in also sharing a little bit with my students and or asking you to share your wisdom and perspective with our students. You bring a specific and sophisticated approach to your research on China's politics and society, based on extensive research, many interviews, and extensive contacts in both Beijing and Washington. And I'm interested to know, what role has your Rolodex, your proverbial Rolodex, played in this, in terms of the success of your research and your analysis? What role have friendships, professional working relationships, frequent travel to Beijing and Washington, and the personal touch played in your work? And then, looking to the next generation of scholars, do you think there's still space for this kind of personal connection And what would you say to students of China today as they behold the current state and trends in U.S. China relations? How can they carve out that anything approaching that kind of space in terms of contacts and friends and networks?
Well, I'll take a stab. There are quite a few different directions I could go, so steer me in the direction you want. But I guess the first thing I would say is I came into the field, depending on when you say you came into a field, but I say it's 1968, 69. And the Cold War was going on. The great proletarian cultural revolution was at its heart. I came into the field and learned skills, mainly document reading, collecting statistics such as they were, and there weren't very many. But I was trained to study China from the outside in, the assumption being I would never, in my entire career, go to the People's Republic of China. At that time, the closest I could get in geographic terms was Hong Kong, because it was under the British. And there you could interview refugees. But that was always a problem because refugees fled their country. They were willing to die to get out of China. So you're interviewing people that are almost uniquely alienated with the system, trying to find out how the system works. That's a real problem. How do you find most people are satisfied enough they don't leave their country? So if you only talk to people who leave their country, you're talking to at least a skewed subset. And then the other place we could get a heavy concentration of people with experience was Taiwan. But once again, that was the other side, that was the losing side of the Chinese Civil War. And so that was a problem, studying China from the losing side of the Civil War. And that was the dilemma I faced when I came into the field. How do I study China from the outside in when all of the outside perches are biased? And you almost had very little documentation beyond local newspapers and the CIA and our government agencies translated broadcasts and the mainland press and so on. So you had translated documents monitored by governments, and you had alienated people you were talking to in either Taiwan or Hong Kong. So I would say I didn't start out with a bed of roses in terms of studying China. So when Nixon went to China, that just totally opened up the aperture for a whole nother approach. Now, it didn't happen instantly. It happened over the decade of the 70s. But by the end of the 70s and normalization and Carter, it became possible to have a strategy of studying China from the inside out. And so I adapted my whole approach to the new opportunity. And it just so happened that China, for its own reasons, wanted to open up and tap particularly intellectuals from the West coming in to help make up for lost time, the lost generation of the Cultural Revolution. And so China was in a remarkably receptive, open period. And I happen to have another approach to studying China that was not unique by any means, but was a little different than what many people were doing. In that whole Cold War period, we were focused mainly on leaders. What did Mao think? When I learned Chinese, it was the documents of the Chinese Communist Party and the speeches of Mao Zedong. And that's sort of how you studied China. You were at the elite level and you were kind of at a document level. I said to myself, and because I was very interested in comparative studies that had been done about water conservancy and public health and education policy, I wanted to study China from the viewpoint of how do they make policy in areas that are important to all of the people. And that means education, health. I eventually did railroads. I did civil nuclear power. But I was always interested where the rubber meets the road with people, with real policy issues on the ground. And so that interest was suddenly able to be exploited by going to China, doing field research. I went out in 1982 to the central China in Hubei province near Wuhan on the Yangtze River and studied flood control, irrigation, hydroelectric planning, and management of the Yangtze River Valley. And that drains 1/3 of China. And I figured if I could figure out how they make policy to control this river, allocate electricity, build flood control, and so forth, I would have another perspective on China and its political system that wasn't so elite dominated. Now, it's true, I did also study leaders, and a couple of the books you mentioned deal with leaders. But my heart's always been on study China from the inside out, study what hits where the rubber hits the road with people on real issues. And so over half of my work, I'm sure, has been devoted to that set of issues.
That's great. And I definitely, we were joking at the beginning about history and political science and the sort of overlap on the Venn diagram. And I think a lot of your work is there as well in terms of as soon as you could get to China, getting into China and really doing that sort of bottom up analysis.
Yeah. Now you did ask if I was in this situation that I started again, which is sort of what's happened here. I think it was just the same intellectual problem. How do you study China, relatively speaking, from the outside in? There's still lots of inside work that can be done, but the space is shrinking. We're not able to see archives, field research and interviews, very much more difficult. So I think the period we're in now has a lot of similarity, at least at the first level, from when I entered the field. But there are some additional possibilities. I mean, we weren't in the computer age when the last time I went through this. We didn't have big data sets. We didn't have China supplying data to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. We didn't have Chinese leaders going all over the world talking to everybody and everybody telling us what the Chinese are doing. So studying China from the outside in now has a lot more possibilities than it did when I just think of what we can do from spatial reconnaissance and satellites and infrared and just the internet and cyber data sets. And so studying China from the inside out or the outside in, the outside in is what we're in, but it's not exactly the same set of skills that I had to hone when I was a younger person 40 years ago.
And that is one thing that when we use this term Cold War, I've heard people flag that as a very, very crucial distinction in terms of access to information and person-to-person contacts, which is such a big part of the work you did.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about, and I want to remind our attendees, you can put questions in the chat, you can raise your hand, and folks who are joining live, of course, can do the same. I'm interested a little bit in looking, because this comes up in the new book, you watch during the age of, the period of engagement, that can definitely be dated from 79, but also back to 72 to some extent, to say 2010 or 2013. I forget exactly where you put that, but sort of when things start to.
I kind of fudge around that.
Yeah, and as a South China Sea person, I definitely look around 2012, 2013,
Yeah.
when the Earth suddenly comes to the surface of the water. And I'm interested in the state side, the American side of things, because you do have some choice words, I think, in terms of how the American government manages the peace dividend, and the engagement period. You mentioned globalization and aspects of instabilities, I think, which we are reaping with a double Trump administration to some extent, the sort of hollow populism, but the self-inflicted wounds, perhaps, that we get in terms of how the inequalities that result from globalization are allowed to develop so profoundly in terms of increasing inequality in an age of globalization, running parallel to engagement with China in terms of, for example, the American industrial sector collapsing, and now there's sort of a lot of rhetoric, at least, about trying to revitalize that. You talk about there being a kind of tolerance for the increasing inequalities that are taking place there in a sort of neoliberal globalization policy, where so much of where the American industrial sector and so much more is being transformed. And then, in addition to that, by the time we get to the early 1990s, we have the peace dividend of the sort of post-Cold War era, definitely in the post-Cold War era at that point, and the inability or the sort of ham-fisted managing of those two factors, with obviously many other aspects to that. Do you have a sense of how those things could have been managed better, in terms of the really dramatically increasing inequality in the American economy, and the tolerance for that? Is there the sort of sanguine approach to globalization and to increasing inequality in the American economy? Do you have some sense of how those things might have been managed better, and how going forward they might be managed in a better way? And I guess I'm asking you to solve all the problems of the American economy at once, but you do touch on this, and I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about how those might have been navigated better.
Well, first of all, I remember back what President Clinton said to one of his aides when talking, a visiting foreign leader was coming, and Clinton asked his aide, what does the visiting foreign leader need out of this trip here to Washington that I could give or withhold that would be important to him when he got back to his society? That is to say, all political leaders survive by virtue of keeping in the saddle of the domestic system. All leaders, in effect, are in the position they are because of internal politics. Now, it's true, your policy towards the world can affect that. But when push comes to shove, are you going to satisfy the other guy or my domestic constituency? You occasionally can spend down your capital in your own society, but you can't go into zero, you can't go negative in terms of your domestic political capital. So every political leader is a domestic leader. And that's what I've always told my students. The first thing you got to learn is about Chinese politics, because all these guys got there by virtue of Chinese politics. And if they get thrown out, killed, or assassinated, it's going to be because of domestic politics in all probability. So I've always thought that the best analysis of political leadership starts with the domestic system, even if your interest is primarily foreign policy. Now, having said all of that, I in my writings, the first book you mentioned, subtitle was Managing U.S. China Relations. I sort of have a technocratic idea of pulling the right leaders, making policies in the right combinations, and you'll get equilibrium in a kind of technological sense. I think we all have to go through that exercise, and we do have some marginal control. But I see the more fundamental process is building. There are sort of social coalitions that take place. And so if you say when Nixon went to China, okay, he took a big risk domestically. It paid off because he could sell it as anti-Soviet, ganging up with the Chinese against the Soviets. He got sort of the strategic benefits of moving towards China, and he brought in, into his coalition realists, and then industry saw opportunities to make money, and then universities saw opportunity for students in China. China specialists like me saw the opportunity to go to China. So in the early stage, you're adding to your coalition, and the snowball is gathering as it goes down the hill. But as your coalition grows, it also hurts people. And this is where globalization comes in. Factory jobs in Gary, Indiana go down the drain. People that have certain political values see increasing, they become alienated from human rights things that they didn't even know about until there was the engagement period. So you build these coalitions, and then they set off a counter reaction, and that coalition builds, and now we're in a negative coalition building. The Democrats and the Republicans and many other groups are now sufficiently alienated from China. They won't support positive policies. So I see this cycle of adding to a positive coalition, that generating the kind of reaction, negative reaction. But at some point, that negative coalition is going to generate problems that will set off new coalitions. So if we get more and more conflict with the Chinese, you can expect more and more groups over time to begin to try to find a way out of that dilemma. So while we often use the phraseology of managing things, we shouldn't exaggerate the degree to which it's a kind of spontaneous, self-generating process that the leader is trying to stay on the back of this bucking bronco, kind of, so to speak. So that's really more the image I have. And I think now we're beginning to see some of the downsides on the current direction. But unfortunately, I think there's a lot more space to go before we begin to reassess the entire direction and what needs to be done. I would say also the Chinese have this process. They lost, we think of all the ways they won in a globalization, to put it crudely. But, the Chinese Communist Party didn't in all respects think it won. A lot of power that was with the party under Mao and was taken away when they moved towards the market. The market began to allocate resources. That represents a loss to all the party bureaucrats that used to control. Many people in the security apparatus saw the erosion of law and order as they understood it in China. The counter-espionage apparatus, huge apparatus in China, they saw this as a loss of control. So, globalization didn't just affect steel workers or auto workers or manufacturing people in the Midwest. They did in China too. And so we're seeing two political systems react to each other, and there's a spontaneous quality as well as a leadership management quality.
Thanks, Mike. That gives us a lot to think about. And I have actually touching on that issue of winning. Stephanie, I'm going to ask the question here, and then we'll go to you live. my colleague Yawen Li, Professor Li in social work, has a question here in the chat about winning and what winning looks like on either side. Amid the ongoing trade war, both sides appear to hold pessimistic views of each other. The U.S. believes that China's economy will suffer significantly, potentially leading to the collapse of the CCP under the weight of social unrest driven by high unemployment. Meanwhile, China views the U.S. as a declining empire with waning global influence, and China stands a chance to challenge the U.S. As a result, the current strategy on both sides seems to revolve around endurance, each side betting that it can outlast the other and ultimately emerge victorious. Do you think this is a correct observation? And what will the winning strategy be for each side?
Well, the winning strategy for each side, of course, there is the possibility, which I take to be the likelihood, is we both are big losers. So if you talk about ultimate outcomes, this isn't a win-win proposition we're in with China. It's zero sum, and indeed, in many respects, we're both going to lose. So that's sort of my one thing to say. But this question of what winning looks like, I think, is a very good question, because the Chinese, it seems to me to be, and I've written on negotiation, and it seems to me, of course, there's no guarantee on always how to be most successful in any given negotiation. But it seems to me that there are some basics, and that we, meaning the United States, are not following what I would take to be the basic pillars of successful negotiation. One is you have to have a clear objective. Now, clear can mean within a single administration at any given time. Does it speak with one voice? Could be it. Generally speaking, when you're dealing with the Chinese, speak with one voice. Now, it's hard in a democracy. It's hard when we're polarized as we are, but it is hard to imagine us speaking with more voices. And then you say, even if you have your leader should speak with one voice. And we have a leader now who isn't even speaking with one set of objectives from one day to the next. And the Chinese, it seems to me, are calculating like all negotiators, and they want to know if they give on one issue, what are they going to get in return on another issue? And if we give you what your priority is, will that buy us some peace in other dimensions of our relationship? And I think right at the moment, we are speaking with too many voices here. Or you might say the wrong voices. You might say, where's Congress in trying to rein in this? But in any case, from the Chinese viewpoint, we've got way too many voices. Now, from our viewpoint, we'd like to hear a few more voices in China. So I think the first thing is we don't have if you asked in foreign policy, who is the voice of U.S. foreign policy? Of course, Trump's very loud here, but we just fired after almost 101 days, the National Security Advisor, who's supposed to integrate different views in the United States, give a coherent set of options to the president, and then the president gets buy-in from his subordinates, and we come back with a defined set of objectives and what we're willing to give up. The Chinese don't know what they're going to get. They don't know what we're going to give up in order to get it. They don't hear one clear, unambiguous voice. We have some voices that seem to say, you know, Taiwan's not that big of an issue. You give us what we want on trade, and we may be a little more congenial on Taiwan policy. Well, of course, that's the first thing. The second thing is if, you know, China is in some dimensions much bigger than we are. So the question is, and it's addressed in an interesting article by Kurt Campbell in recent Foreign Affairs, is you need to get mass when you're smaller than the other guy. Well, that translates in international affairs to you want more friends, not fewer. But what are we doing? We're attacking all our allies. So rather than gathering people in of like-minded, like interests into your coalition, we're driving our natural allies away from it. So the Chinese aren't clear what we want. They don't know who speaks for us. We're alienating our allies. And I think the Chinese are in no damn hurry to do anything. And then I think there's another, I always remember the conversation I had with somebody on North Korea. And I was saying it seems like the North Korean leadership is willing to impose eternal bitterness on its people to get leverage. And he says, yes, we Chinese can eat bitterness, but we don't hold a candle to the North Korean. Well, I think the threshold for pain in China in negotiations is greater than ours. I mean, we're a democracy in which it's the economy, stupid, and when other things are affecting the economy, that becomes our priority. So I think the Chinese think they can outweigh us. So if you're not clear, you don't speak with one voice, they're not sure about your commitment to core issues like Taiwan, perhaps. We're just in a terrible position. I can always be surprised. I'm not making an unambiguous prediction, but I think the Chinese are not going to cave.
That's a really valuable point, I think, about and thanks, Yawen, for the question about America's allies. One of the most important roles, I think, of Beijing in foreign policy has been to try to peel off some of our allies, and right now they're watching us do it so much more effectively than they could do it, with such speed and such alacrity, really just kicking our allies in a way that they can just sort of sit and watch and say, okay, that's a lot more effective than anything we had planned. It's remarkable. It's Stephanie here in the classroom.
That actually funnily leads up into my question. What do you think of the formation of coalitions or economical international alliances like BRICS and China becoming such a big influence in such coalitions, especially now how previous talks of a new currency being made are now speeding up its process due to United States' current administration's aggression towards foreign powers?
So BRICS and
that's a good question. And you mentioned BRICS. I don't think it's certainly, it's becoming bigger and more inclusive. And so I would say China's moving in the direction of building a broader South-South oriented coalition. And the United States, I mean, we do away with USAID, so we don't have the kind of resources to really be in the development game. I wrote a book on China building railroads in Southeast Asia. We're not even in that game. So I would say China is multilateralizing somewhat. It's devoting more resources to cultivating a South-South coalition, and then, as Jeremy said, is peeling off our more traditional allies. I mean, it's to the point now where elections in other countries are reactions to Trump, and now we're having leaders in Canada and Australia that are, in fact, were unanticipated a few months ago because of the reaction to Trump. So I think the coalitions aren't working for us, and China's got a much more, I think, sensible policy for the moment. Now, lest I paint Chinese foreign policy as an unmitigated show of superb diplomacy, China is also engaging in activities that alienate many of these countries, particularly in Southeast Asia and what Jeremy studies, the South China Sea and so forth. It's certainly intimidating Taiwan, Japan. So there's a lot for improvement in Chinese foreign policy. But I think broadly speaking, China's devoting resources to gathering support in the global system. And right now, the United States is alienating it.
Thanks, Stephanie, for the question. And thanks, Mike. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. I have a question in the chat from Andrea, who's asking, realize that you focus on more than just the top leaders in U.S. China relations, but I'm writing a paper on the Carter administration and the Chinese leadership's motivation for normalizing relations. So that Carter's administration's and the Chinese leadership's motivation for normalization in '79. I read some of your chapter on normalization and living U.S. China relations. I was also wondering if you think that science and education cooperation between the two countries was one of the motivations for the U.S. to normalize relations, or if this type of cooperation just meant to improve between the two countries. Sorry, go ahead.
That's a great question, and thanks so much for it, because a lot of the book actually deals with that. First of all, this is where leaders matter. We were talking about Chinese leaders and Deng and so forth. But Jimmy Carter, in this regard, and of course he did Camp David and the Panama Canal as well at that time in the late 70s. But China and the normalization was a reflection in many respects of the personal commitment of President Carter. President Carter grew up in the South of a very religious and evangelical type family, and he writes in his memoirs that when he was a little boy, they in Christian churches pass around the plate or the cup, and you're supposed to put donations in for both the support of the church and also its activities abroad. In that era, it was missionaries in many places, but certainly China was prominent for his congregation. So he talks about how he, on Sundays, spent a nickel every Sunday to send to China. And he remembered that, and I later had dinner with him, and he brought it up again. He had a personal commitment. And then in the late 40s, after he was an engineer, a nuclear engineer, he went in on a submarine into Qingdao, and he saw all of post-war China. And he said, this is a problem and a people I would like to get closer to the people in the future, improve our relations with them. And so he had a personal connection. Secondly, he was a scientist, ultimately a nuclear engineer. He appreciated science and technology. And this is where in the book it happens to hit right on me. I had written my first book on the politics of medicine in China. And so this attuned me to some of the more technical, medical, scientific kind of dimensions of U.S. China relations. And when Carter normalized with China, he deputized different secretaries of different cabinet departments to go to China and connect educationally and technologically with China. So Environmental Protection Agency, the Energy Department, the Health and Education and Welfare Department. He went right down the functional areas of technological departments and said, we're going to connect to China in each of these areas. And he asked me to go with the Secretary of Health, Education and Welfare and sign the health and the education agreements between the United States and China. And those both exist today, and they are among the most successful. And the idea was, if we functionally connect our societies, environment office to environment office, health department to health department, energy to energy, we then make this a tighter knit fabric that is more difficult to rip apart. And he had a very self-conscious commitment to science, to China, and building a relationship that wasn't just between, Deng and Jimmy Carter, but between many different functional levels. And of course, when you're in health, then you go to medical schools and universities. And it's no accident. The other thing Carter did was basically, unlike with the Soviet Union, if the Soviets sent one, say, physicist to MIT, then effectively an American physicist in the same field had to go to the Soviet Union. It was a one-for-one trade. Carter said, I don't want to do that. Chinese can come here as great a numbers as they can afford. The only thing is, we're not going to pay for it. But of course, meaning the government wasn't going to pay for it. But Chinese students, very capable. They became TAs, RAs. In 2019, before COVID, there were 375,000 Chinese here. The Soviet Union never sent even a scintilla of that number of people. So I think the big plus was Deng was committed to science and technology, and so was Jimmy Carter. And indeed, if you look at the previous wave before, in the late 1900s, early 20th century, China had sent a wave of students then, and they'd gone, some of them, back to China, and they provided the plug-in for when Carter wanted to renew the relationship. So even the bad times we're having in science and technology now, I think those people that have been trained in those connections and institutional relations, they will come back. They will be useful. Now, whether it's 2 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, I don't know. But I think this is a key area.
Thank you for that, Mike. And you can read about that in Mike's, Professor Lampton's new book, Living U.S. China Relations from Cold War to Cold War. You get a sense of the medical background, of the interest in things like the schistosomiasis campaign. A classmate of mine, Miriam Gross, actually studied that also at UCSD. She's out at Oklahoma now. There's so much about there's so much to illuminate the last few decades of U.S. China relations, but also that points us with, I think, optimism that I think is warranted, and hope, I think, for new directions. I have several cans of night crawlers here that I love to open up and talk for another 2 or 3 hours with Mike about, but I do have to let you go, have your dinner in Washington, and for us to wrap up our class here. It's been an absolute delight and honor to chat with you, Mike. I hope everybody enjoys your book. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for your attention, and I've enjoyed the questions. So maybe in the future we can do it again.
I love that, Mike. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care.
Bye.